Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Imagine finding out your parents took your sibling on a dream vacation. First-class flights, luxury resorts, the works. While you stayed home with a $20 gift card as your consolation prize. Well, that's exactly what happened to me. But trust me, the story doesn't end there. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was sitting on the couch with my laptop, half watching TV and half responding to work emails when my phone rang. It was my mom. Her voice was unusually chipper as she greeted me, the kind of tone that usually meant she was about to share some big news. "Guess what?" she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. "What's up?" I asked, already preparing myself for one of her elaborate stories or updates about my sister, who always seemed to be the center of family attention. "We're planning a big surprise for your sister's birthday," she exclaimed, practically squealing with joy. I smiled despite myself. My sister was turning 22 in a couple of weeks, and while we weren't particularly close, I was happy for her. It sounded like Mom was going all out this year, which didn't surprise me. Our parents had always had a soft spot for her, showering her with attention and gifts, especially on special occasions. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, playing along. "Oh, it's going to be incredible," Mom gushed. "We're taking her to Paris. First-class flights, tickets to the Eiffel Tower, a suite at the Ritz-Carlton, and we've even booked a private chef for her birthday dinner." At first, I was genuinely impressed. Paris was a dream destination, and it sounded like they were pulling out all the stops. Naturally, I assumed this was a family trip. "Wow, that sounds amazing," I said. "What dates are you thinking? I'll need to ask for time off work." There was a pause, a beat too long to be casual. When my mom spoke again, her tone had shifted, taking on that overly sweet, almost condescending quality she used when she was trying to let me down gently. "Oh, honey," she said, dragging out the words. "This trip is just for your sister. It's her birthday, after all." Her words hit me like a bucket of cold water. "Just for her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Yes, just for her," she repeated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "We wanted to do something really special for her this year. But don't worry, we didn't forget about you." I should have known something was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. "We're sending you a little something so you don't feel left out," she added brightly. Okay," I said cautiously. "What is it?" "It's a gift card. $20 to that coffee shop you love," she said, as though she had just announced the most thoughtful gesture ever. There was a moment of silence as I processed what she'd just said. A $20 gift card. For coffee. While my sister was being whisked away to Paris for a luxury vacation. "Wow," I finally said, struggling to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "That's thoughtful." My mom either didn't pick up on my tone or chose to ignore it. "I knew you'd understand," she said cheerfully. "You've always been so independent, so practical. You don't need all the fuss like your sister does." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Right?" I said flatly. "Well, thanks for thinking of me." As I hung up the phone, a mix of emotions bubbled to the surface. Hurt, anger, disbelief. I knew my parents had always favored my sister, but this felt like a whole new level of blatant favoritism. I stared at the phone, still clutching it in my hand. $20 for coffee. That was what they thought of me. In the days that followed, I tried to shake off the hurt, telling myself it wasn't worth getting upset over. But every time I thought about the trip, the first-class flights, the Eiffel Tower, the suite at the Ritz, it stung all over again. It wasn't just about the trip itself. It was about what it represented. My parents were willing to spend thousands of dollars to make my sister feel special. But when it came to me, a $20 gift card was enough. And the worst part? I had a sinking feeling this wasn't just a one-time oversight. This was part of a pattern, one I'd been too hesitant to confront until now. Something had to change. About a week after my mom's call, a small envelope arrived in the mail. I recognized her handwriting on the front, cheerful and loopy, as though this was a birthday card or some other celebratory note. For a fleeting moment, I let myself hope. Maybe the gift card wasn't the only thing they had planned for me. Maybe this was some sort of gesture to make up for the blatant disparity. I opened it eagerly, only to feel my heart sink. Inside was a plain card with a $20 gift card to a local coffee shop, the one I stopped by occasionally on my way to work. My mom had scribbled a note on the inside. "For you, so you don't feel left out. Love, Mom and Dad." I stared at it, my disbelief quickly morphing into anger. The whole thing felt so dismissive, so transactional, like they'd throw me a bone just to quiet me down. I held the card in my hand for a long time, the words blurring as my mind raced. This was supposed to make up for missing out on Paris? For being excluded from a once-in-a-lifetime experience? My sister was flying first class, staying in luxury, and sipping champagne, while I was supposed to feel included because I could grab 2 lattes and maybe a muffin. After a few hours of stewing, I decided I couldn't just let it go. I picked up the phone and called my mom, determined to stay calm. "Hey, I got the gift card you sent me," I said, doing my best to keep my voice even. "Oh, good," she replied, her tone as chipper as ever. "I thought you'd like that." I took a deep breath. "Is this all you were planning to do for me?" She laughed, as if I just asked her the most absurd question in the world. "Well, yes," she said. "What else would we do? This trip is for your sister. It's her birthday." Her nonchalance sent a fresh wave of anger through me, but I held it back. "I get that," I said carefully. "But don't you think it's a little unfair? You're spending thousands of dollars on her, and I get a $20 gift card." "Oh, come on," she said, brushing me off. "It's not a big deal. We just wanted to make your sister's birthday special. You understand, right?" I gritted my teeth. "No, Mom, I don't understand." The conversation spiraled from there. My mom kept trying to downplay it, insisting that I was overreacting. "We've done nice things for you too," she argued, though she couldn't seem to name anything specific. "You've always been so independent. You don't need us to do big things for you like your sister does." There was again that excuse they'd always used. Because I wasn't as needy as my sister, I didn't deserve the same effort or attention. "Being independent doesn't mean I don't want to feel valued," I shot back. "You could have at least invited me to join you. Even if I couldn't go, it would have been nice to be considered." My mom sighed, as if I was being difficult for no reason. "Honey, it's just a trip. We'll do something for you another time." "Will you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, because it feels like I'm always the afterthought. She didn't have a response to that, and the conversation ended awkwardly. I hung up feeling drained and defeated, my emotions swirling between hurt and anger. In the days that followed, I kept turning the situation over in my mind. It wasn't just about the trip or the gift card. It was about the pattern it represented. This wasn't the first time I'd been treated as less important, and I doubted it would be the last. I remembered all the little moments over the years. My sister getting the better birthday parties, the bigger Christmas presents, the more elaborate gestures. My accomplishments were acknowledged with polite applause, while hers were celebrated with full-blown fanfare. I tried to talk to a close friend about it, hoping for some perspective. "Maybe they just don't realize how it's coming across," she suggested. "Have you told them how much it's bothering you?" "I tried," I said, "but they just brushed it off. They always act like I'm overreacting." "That's not okay," she said firmly. "You deserve better." Her words stuck with me, sparking a resolve I hadn't felt before. I couldn't keep letting this slide. If my parents weren't going to see how unfairly they were treating me, maybe it was time to make them see. I didn't know how yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a trip or a gift card. It was about respect, and I was done settling for less. The day my sister's Paris trip began, her Instagram turned into a nonstop highlight reel. The first post was a picture of her sitting in what was unmistakably a first-class airplane seat. A glass of champagne sparkled in her hand, and the caption read, "Paris, here we come." Feeling so blessed for this amazing birthday gift. By the next day, her feed was overflowing with perfectly staged photos. There she was, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower in a designer coat, posing at a cafe with a croissant and coffee, and smiling on a boat during a river cruise. The captions all had the same tone, gushing about how special this trip was and how much she deserved this amazing experience. Meanwhile, I was at home, staring at my phone with a mix of frustration and sadness. Every new post felt like a reminder of how much I didn't matter to my family. My sister's carefree smile, my parents in the background looking like the picture-perfect, doting mom and dad. It all felt so unfair. It wasn't just the trip they'd excluded me from. It was the feeling of being completely left out of their world. By the third day of their trip, the messages started rolling in from friends and acquaintances who had seen my sister's posts. "Why didn't you go?" one friend texted. "Didn't your parents invite you?" another asked, clearly confused. I didn't know how to answer without sounding bitter. They wanted it to be a special trip just for her, I typed back to one friend. It felt like the safest explanation, even if it wasn't the full truth. "That sucks," they replied. "You should have been there." It was like they were echoing the thoughts that had been swirling in my head since this whole thing started. I should have been there. At the very least, I should have been considered. The messages didn't stop. A coworker who followed my sister online sent me a text that cut even deeper. "Wow, your sister's trip looks incredible," they wrote. "Your parents must be so proud of you both to do something like that." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Proud of both of us? That was laughable. My parents had made it perfectly clear who they were proud of, and it wasn't me. I didn't reply to that one. What could I say? The truth was, this wasn't just about Paris. It was about years of being sidelined, years of watching my sister bask in the spotlight while I faded into the background. The trip was just the most blatant example of a dynamic that had been there all along. One night, I decided to stop torturing myself and stay off social media. But even that didn't help. Friends and acquaintances kept bringing up the trip in casual conversation. "Your sister's photos are amazing," one said. "Paris looks so beautiful. I saw your parents in the background of that dinner picture," another added. "They seemed so proud of her." Every comment felt like a jab. My parents were proud of her, but when it came to me, all they seemed to have was excuses and half-hearted gestures. The final blow came on the last night of their trip when my sister posted a video from her birthday dinner. In it, my parents handed her a small velvet box. She opened it to reveal a delicate gold necklace, one that probably cost more than I made in a month. "My parents are the best," my sister said in the video, holding the necklace up for the camera. "This trip has been the best birthday gift ever. I'm so lucky to have them." I set my phone down, my hands trembling with frustration. Lucky. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just that she was lucky. It was that I was the one left behind, the one who had to watch from the sidelines while they showered her with love and attention. Unable to keep it bottled up any longer, I texted my mom. "Nice trip," I wrote. "Must be nice to be the one who's lucky." Her reply came quickly, but didn't address what I was really saying. "Don't be like that," she wrote. "You know we love you too." Too. That single word was like a slap in the face. It wasn't a denial. It was an admission. I wasn't the one they loved. I was an afterthought, someone they loved in the leftover spaces after they'd poured everything into my sister. I put my phone down and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. It was clearer than ever. In my family, love wasn't equal. And if my parents couldn't see how much they were hurting me, I was going to have to find a way to make them see. The breaking point came on a Sunday evening when my phone buzzed with a notification for a family group call. I hesitated for a moment before joining. My parents were still in Paris, and I could already imagine their glowing smiles as they recounted their luxurious escapades. Still, part of me wanted to see if they would even acknowledge how I was feeling, or if this call would just be another reminder of where I stood in the family pecking order. As the screen loaded, there they were, my mom and dad, seated side by side at what looked like a fancy outdoor cafe. The Eiffel Tower glimmered in the background, and the faint hum of Parisian street noise made it feel like I was watching a travel show. My sister was next to them, her hair perfectly styled, holding up a coffee cup with some intricate latte art. They looked radiant, like they didn't have a single care in the world. "Hi, sweetheart," my mom said, her voice dripping with warmth. "We just wanted to check in and say hello. It's been such a magical trip." My sister jumped in immediately. "You have no idea how incredible it is here. Paris is everything I imagined and more. The food, the shopping, the sights. It's just been unreal." She paused for dramatic effect. "So, what have you been up to?" I knew it wasn't meant as a dig, but the casual way she asked stung. What had I been up to? Working, cleaning my apartment, watching TV, using the $20 gift card they'd sent me while they frolicked around Europe. "Oh, just working and, using that gift card you sent me," I said, my voice laced with sarcasm. The smile on my mom's face faltered, just for a second. "We didn't mean to make you feel left out," she said quickly, her tone shifting to that practiced blend of sympathy and dismissal she always used to deflect conflict. "But your sister deserves this. You've always been more independent." There it was again, the same excuse they always used to justify treating us differently. I was the independent one, the one who didn't need anything, and apparently, that meant I didn't deserve anything either. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "So, being independent means I don't get treated like part of the family?" "Got it," I snapped. My dad cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "That's not what we're saying," he started, but I cut him off. "Then what are you saying?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've gone out of your way to make this trip all about her, and I'm just supposed to be fine with it. I didn't even get an invitation. A $20 gift card doesn't make up for that." "That's not fair," my mom said, her voice growing defensive. "We've done plenty for you over the years." "Really?" I shot back. "Name one thing. One thing that even comes close to a trip to Paris." The silence on the other end was deafening. My sister looked down at her coffee, avoiding eye contact, while my parents exchanged awkward glances. Finally, my mom sighed. "We just thought this would be a special way to celebrate your sister's birthday," she said. "You've always been the strong one, the one who doesn't need us as much." Your sister. She needs more. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. So, because I don't need you as much, I get less? I asked, my voice rising. That's how family works? The people who ask for the most get the most, and the ones who keep their heads down get scraps. That's not what we mean, my dad interjected, but I wasn't done. You've been doing this my whole life, I said, the floodgates opening. Every birthday, every holiday, she always gets more. More attention, more praise, more everything. And you justify it by saying I don't need it, like that makes it okay. My sister finally spoke up, her tone defensive. I didn't ask for this, she said. They just wanted to do something nice for me. It's not my fault. I'm not blaming you, I said, turning to her. But don't act like you don't see the difference in how they treat us. You've always been the favorite, and I'm tired of pretending it doesn't bother me. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mom looked genuinely hurt, but instead of addressing what I'd said, she pivoted. We didn't mean to hurt you, she said softly. But can't you just be happy for your sister? It's her birthday, after all. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course. It's always about her, isn't it? The call ended shortly after that, with my parents promising we'd talk more about this later. But I knew nothing would come of it. They'd brush it under the rug just like they always did and hope I'd let it go. After I hung up, I sat on my couch, staring at the blank screen. For years, I convinced myself that this dynamic was just something I had to accept, that speaking up wouldn't change anything. But for the first time, I felt like I couldn't stay quiet anymore. This wasn't just about the trip. It was about a lifetime of feeling like I didn't matter as much. And if my parents weren't willing to acknowledge that, maybe it was time to show them what it felt like to be left out. After that explosive family call, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. The more I thought about my mom's words, "You've always been the strong one, the one who doesn't need us as much," the more they grated on me. It wasn't just the Paris trip. It was a pattern, a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter as much. I started combing through my memories, and it was like a floodgate opened. I remembered the year my sister graduated from high school, and my parents surprised her with a brand new car. She squealed with excitement as they handed her the keys to a shiny red sedan parked in the driveway. When I graduated 2 years later, I got a used laptop. Sure, it was practical, but the disparity couldn't have been more obvious. Then there were the holidays. Every Christmas, my sister's pile of gifts seemed to tower over mine. She got the newest gadgets, designer clothes, or expensive jewelry. I got practical items, socks, a blender, maybe a book. One year, they gave her a trip to New York with her friends, while I got a toolkit. My dad had joked, "You're so handy. We thought this would be perfect for you." At the time, I forced a laugh, but now, looking back, it stung. It wasn't just about material things, either. My parents had always been more involved in my sister's life. They went to every one of her school plays, cheering loudly from the audience and showering her with flowers afterward. They bragged about her to friends and family, her grades, her college acceptance, even her minor accomplishments like learning to cook a new dish. When it came to me, their attention was lukewarm at best. They'd say, "We're proud of you," but it always felt like an afterthought. They rarely came to my events, and when they did, they seemed distracted, their eyes flicking to their phones or glancing at the clock. If my sister made a mistake, it was met with excuses or sympathy. "She's just stressed," they'd say. "Give her some time to figure things out." But if I messed up, the response was starkly different. "You should have known better," they'd say. "You're more responsible than that." The double standard was exhausting, and until now, I had always brushed it aside, telling myself I was overreacting. But after the Paris debacle, it was impossible to ignore. Desperate for some validation, I decided to reach out to my aunt, someone who had always seemed more neutral. Aunt Diane wasn't one to sugarcoat things, and I knew she wouldn't dismiss my feelings. We met for coffee a few days later. As soon as I started explaining the situation, her face softened with a mix of sympathy and understanding. "Oh, honey," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "It's not your imagination. They've always spoiled your sister." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. For years, I'd questioned whether I was reading too much into things, but hearing it from someone else confirmed everything I'd suspected. "I've tried to say something to them before," Aunt Diane continued, shaking her head, "but they just brush me off. Your mom always says, it's just easier this way, like it's a convenience thing. And your dad, well, he doesn't want to rock the boat." "Easier?" I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. "How is it easier to constantly favor one child over the other?" "Because your sister makes a fuss if she doesn't get her way," Aunt Diane said bluntly. "And you don't. They've gotten used to you being the easy one, the one who doesn't complain. It's not fair, but that's how they've justified it." Her words made sense, but they also made me angrier. My parents' favoritism wasn't just a random quirk. It was a deliberate choice. They catered to my sister because it was convenient, because I didn't demand their attention the way she did. After our conversation, I felt a mix of validation and betrayal. On one hand, it was a relief to know I wasn't imagining things. On the other hand, it hurt to realize just how ingrained the favoritism was. My parents weren't oblivious. They were complicit. I spent the next few days reflecting on what Aunt Diane had said. I couldn't shake her comment about my sister making a fuss. Was I supposed to start causing problems just to get noticed? The idea felt foreign to me, but maybe that was part of the issue. I'd spent so long being the easy one, the independent one, that my parents had stopped seeing me as someone who needed or deserved their attention. It wasn't about the Paris trip anymore. It was about the years of imbalance, the sense that I was always in the background while my sister took center stage. And now that I'd finally acknowledged it, I couldn't go back to pretending everything was fine. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I wasn't sure what to do about the present. Confronting my parents had gotten me nowhere, and I didn't want to keep banging my head against a wall. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep letting them treat me like an afterthought. For the first time in my life, I started to consider what it would look like to set boundaries with them, to demand more, or maybe to step away entirely if they couldn't give it. It wasn't a decision I could make overnight, but the seed had been planted. I was tired of being the strong one, the one who didn't need anything. I wanted to feel valued, not just for what I could do for others, but for who I was. And if my parents couldn't give me that, maybe it was time to stop looking to them for it. It was late, and I was lying in bed, scrolling aimlessly through social media. My sister's Paris posts had slowed down since they returned, but the highlights of the trip were still there in all their over-the-top glory. Every caption and photo reminded me of how I'd been left out. I thought I was desensitized to it by now, but it still stung every time her posts crossed my feed. As I scrolled, a notification popped up, a private message from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was a blank default, and the username was a random jumble of letters and numbers. For a moment, I thought it was spam and almost ignored it, but the subject line caught my attention. About your sister's trip? Curious, I opened it. I saw your sister's posts. The message began. I think you deserve to know something. I sat up, my heart racing. Who is this? What do they mean? The message continued. Your parents have been planning that trip for over a year. They've been saving up for it by cutting corners, including canceling a family trip they promised you last year. The one they said they couldn't afford? That wasn't true. They lied to you, so they could make this happen for her. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. My mind flashed back to the canceled trip, the one we'd talked about for months, only for my parents to suddenly claim budget issues made it impossible. It had been disappointing, sure, but I hadn't questioned it at the time. Now it took on a whole new meaning. They hadn't just excluded me from the Paris trip. They'd actively lied to me, using the excuse of money problems to justify canceling something I'd been looking forward to. Also, they could secretly funnel their resources into my sister's extravagant birthday celebration. I felt a mix of anger and nausea. My parents had always favored my sister, but this went beyond favoritism. This was deliberate deception. I quickly typed a response. Who is this? How do you know that? The message remained unread. I checked back an hour later, then again the next morning, but whoever had sent it wasn't responding. The account went silent, and I began to wonder if it had been deactivated entirely. At first, I thought it might be someone from my sister's circle, a friend or acquaintance who had seen through the charade and wanted to clue me in. But the anonymity of the message made it impossible to confirm. Part of me doubted the truth of it. Could my parents really have planned this for over a year, knowing how much it would hurt me? But the timeline lined up too perfectly. I remembered the canceled family trip vividly. The way my mom had casually mentioned it over dinner, saying, "We just can't make it work this year. Things are tight." At the time, I had accepted it without question. Now it felt like a betrayal. I debated whether to confront them, but I knew they'd deny everything. They'd already dismissed my feelings when I brought up the Paris trip. What would stop them from brushing this off too? The anonymous message started to consume me. I went back through my texts, emails, and even my bank records, trying to piece together the timeline. I found an email thread about the canceled family trip, filled with excuses about unexpected expenses and priorities. I also remembered how, around the same time, my mom had started talking about how important it was to give your sister a special 22nd birthday. Everything fit. They'd been planning this for months, if not longer, and they'd been lying to me the whole time. I couldn't let it go. The thought of them sitting around, strategizing how to pull this off while keeping me in the dark, made my blood boil. They hadn't just excluded me. They'd gone out of their way to prioritize her at my expense. The message also made me question how much else they'd lied about over the years. How many other budget issues had been excuses? How many times had they told me I was being unreasonable when the truth was that they'd simply chosen not to prioritize me? Despite my anger, I felt a growing sense of helplessness. What was I supposed to do with this information? Confronting them would only lead to more excuses, and they'd probably accuse me of being ungrateful or bitter. But staying silent felt unbearable. I confided in Aunt Diane again, telling her about the message and my suspicions. She listened patiently, her expression growing more serious as I talked. I wouldn't put it past them, she said finally. Your parents love you, but they've always had blind spots when it comes to your sister. They probably justified it to themselves, thinking you'd understand. Understand? I said bitterly. How am I supposed to understand being lied to? Being left out? She sighed. I don't have an easy answer for you, but I think you need to decide what you want. If you're going to confront them, be ready for them to deny it. But if you're not, then you need to figure out how to move forward without their validation. Her words stuck with me. For so long, I've been chasing my parents' approval, trying to convince myself that I mattered as much as my sister. But now, I wasn't sure I even wanted their validation anymore. The anonymous message had ripped open old wounds and exposed truths I hadn't been ready to face. My parents' favoritism wasn't just a quirk or an accident, it was a choice. And while I couldn't change how they treated me in the past, I could decide how I wanted to handle it moving forward. I didn't know what my next step would be, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let their lies define my worth anymore. After reading the anonymous message, I couldn't let it rest. If there was any chance my parents had planned the Paris trip while lying about canceling our family vacation, I needed proof. I didn't just want to confront them with vague accusations. I wanted something concrete. I started by combing through my phone, searching for old texts and emails from my parents around the time they canceled the family trip. It didn't take long to find a series of messages from my mom. Sorry, sweetie, one email said. We've been looking at our finances, and this year's just not a good time for a big trip. Maybe next year. There were more like it, all dripping with vague excuses. We're trying to tighten the budget a bit, another read. Things are just a little tight right now. At the time, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? My parents had always positioned themselves as financially responsible, so it hadn't occurred to me to question their reasoning. But now, with the Paris trip fresh in my mind, those messages took on a more sinister tone. As I continued searching, I stumbled across something that made my heart stop. Buried in my email inbox was a forwarded message from my mom, dated nearly 8 months before my sister's birthday. It was a group email titled, Paris Itinerary, Final Details. At first, I thought it must have been sent by mistake. Why would I be included in an email about a trip I wasn't invited to? But as I opened it, the truth became clear. The email contained a detailed breakdown of the trip. Flight times, hotel bookings, dinner reservations. My mom had forwarded it to my dad, my sister, and accidentally, I realized my name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the email, and there was no indication that I was part of the planning. This was an itinerary for 3 people, my parents and my sister. They had booked everything months before they canceled the family trip, meaning the entire time they were feeding me excuses about budget issues. They'd already committed thousands of dollars to this lavish birthday celebration. I stared at the screen, a mix of anger and hurt swirling inside me. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was outright betrayal. Armed with the itinerary and the string of emails about budget tightening, I decided it was time to confront my parents. I wasn't sure what I expected. An apology, maybe? At the very least, I wanted an explanation. That evening, I called them. My mom answered, her voice warm and casual, like she wasn't hiding a thing. Hi, sweetie. How are you? Mom, I said, cutting straight to the point. We need to talk. The tone of my voice must have tipped her off, because her cheerful demeanor immediately faltered. Is everything okay? No, I said. I found some emails about Paris and about how you canceled the family trip because of budget issues. Care to explain how those 2 things line up? There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that screams guilt. Finally, she spoke. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, I snapped. I found the itinerary, Mom. You booked the Paris trip months before you told me we couldn't afford the family vacation. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? By this point, my dad had picked up the call. What's going on? He asked, his tone wary. Why don't you explain it, Dad? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Explain why you canceled a trip we'd all been looking forward to so you could save up for Paris without telling me. My dad hesitated. Look, we didn't mean to hurt you, he said carefully. It wasn't an easy decision, but we wanted to do something special for your sister. She's been going through a lot lately, and we thought this would lift her spirits. Going through a lot? I repeated, incredulous. What exactly has she been going through? Because last I checked, she's living her best life while you two cater to her every whim. That's not fair, my mom said defensively. You know we love you just as much. Really? I shot back. Because it sure doesn't feel that way. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to find out about that trip through her Instagram? Or how insulting it was to get a $20 gift card as my consolation prize? My dad sighed, the sound full of frustration. This isn't about the money, he said. No, it's about the lies, I said firmly. You could have told me the truth. You could have included me in the conversation. But instead, you lied to me and made me feel like I wasn't even part of this family. My mom's voice cracked when she spoke again. We didn't think you'd understand. You've always been so independent, so strong. We thought you wouldn't mind. I laughed bitterly. You thought I wouldn't mind being lied to? Being left out? You thought I wouldn't notice that everything always revolves around her. My parents tried to justify their actions, falling back on the same tired excuses about my sister needing more and me being the strong one. But their words fell hollow. For the first time, I realized that they weren't going to change. They didn't see a problem with how they treated me because, in their minds, they'd already decided I didn't need as much from them. By the end of the call, I felt drained. My parents didn't apologize. Not really. They insisted they loved me, that they hadn't meant to hurt me, but it was clear they didn't fully grasp how deeply their actions had cut. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Confronting them hadn't brought the closure I'd hoped for, but it had solidified something in my mind. I couldn't keep chasing their approval or waiting for them to treat me equally. If they couldn't see my worth, I'd have to stop looking to them for validation. It was a painful realization, but it felt like the first step towards something I hadn't had in years, freedom. The confrontation was inevitable. After discovering the itinerary, rereading the emails, and stewing over their blatant favoritism, I knew I couldn't let it slide. I didn't care if it led to another circular argument filled with excuses. I was tired of being the silent, strong one in the family. I called my parents on a Saturday afternoon when I knew they'd both be home. My voice was steady, but the anger simmered beneath the surface as I got straight to the point. I know about the Paris trip, I said. I know you planned it months before you canceled our family vacation. I found the itinerary and all those emails about budget issues. So, are you finally going to tell me the truth? Or do you want to keep pretending this was all some big misunderstandings? There was a pause, and then my mom sighed deeply. We didn't think you'd mind, she said, her tone laced with a mix of exasperation and defensiveness. You've always been so self-sufficient. Your sister, she just needs more. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, because I'm self-sufficient, I get less? I asked, my voice rising. That's how family works? That's not what we're saying, my dad interjected, his voice calm but patronizing. It's not about giving you less. It's about giving her what she needs. What she needs. I shot back. She needs a luxury vacation, and I get $20? Do you even hear yourselves? Do you realize how insulting that is? My mom started to respond, but I wasn't done. You lied to me. You told me we couldn't afford a family trip, and all the while, you were funneling money into this extravagant celebration for her. Do you have any idea how that feels? To know you were planning something so huge for her while feeding me excuses? My mom's voice cracked as she spoke again, leaning into her usual script. We didn't mean to hurt you. You've always been the strong one, the independent one. We thought you'd understand. Stop saying that. I snapped. I'm so tired of hearing about how strong and independent I am. Those aren't compliments when they're just excuses for ignoring me. I'm independent because I had to be, because you put all your energy into her and left me to fend for myself. My dad chimed in, his tone growing defensive. That's not fair. We've done plenty for you over the years. You're acting like we've never cared about you. And that's just not true. Then name one thing, I said coldly. Name one thing you've done for me that even comes close to what you did for her with this trip. One time when you went out of your way to make me feel special. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could almost picture them sitting there, exchanging awkward glances, grasping for an example that didn't exist. Finally, my mom spoke, her voice soft. We didn't realize you felt this way. How could you not? I asked. I've tried to tell you before, but you just brush it off. You've always treated her like she's the one who needs your love and attention. And I'm just there. The one who doesn't complain, so you don't bother. My dad let out a heavy sigh. It's not that simple. Your sister has always been more sensitive. She takes things harder. You know how she is? Yeah, I do, I said bitterly. She takes things harder, so you bend over backward to make her happy. Meanwhile, I take things quietly, so you assume I'm fine. Do you know how exhausting that is? To always be the one who has to be okay, because you can't be bothered to check if I'm not. That's not what we meant to do, my mom said quickly. We love you, and we didn't mean to make you feel left out. Well, you did, I said. And this isn't just about the Paris trip. This is about a lifetime of feeling like I don't matter as much. Every birthday, every holiday, she always gets more. More attention, more praise, more effort. You might not see it, but I do. And I'm done pretending it's okay. My mom started to cry, which was her usual go-to when she felt cornered. We've tried our best, she said through tears. We never meant to hurt you. We thought you'd understand that we were just trying to do something nice for her. At my expense, I said flatly. The conversation ended shortly after that. My parents promised we'd talk more, but I knew they were just trying to end the call without resolving anything. They didn't apologize, not really. Instead, they fell back on their usual excuses, insisting they hadn't meant to hurt me and that they loved me just as much. When I hung up, I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved to have finally said everything I'd been holding in for so long. But another part of me felt empty. Confronting them hadn't brought the closure I'd hoped for. They didn't get it. They couldn't see how deeply their actions had cut, and I wasn't sure they ever would. As I sat there, replaying the conversation in my head, one thought kept coming back to me. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep looking to them for validation, waiting for them to treat me equally. If they couldn't see my worth, I'd have to stop expecting them to. It was a painful realization, but it felt like the start of something new. For the first time, I began to think about what it would look like to step back, to create boundaries, to stop chasing the approval I might never get. I wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but one thing was clear. I deserved better than this. After that explosive confrontation, I felt both drained and strangely liberated. For the first time, I had laid everything out for my parents. The years of favoritism, the way their excuses had worn me down, and how much their actions had hurt me. But their inability to truly understand left me with a bitter clarity. Nothing would change unless I made it change. I decided to step back. No more chasing their approval. No more trying to explain why their actions hurt me when they refused to listen. I needed space, and more importantly, I needed to prioritize my own well-being. When my mom called the next day, I let it go to voicemail. Her message was apologetic, but tinged with defensiveness. We didn't mean to upset you, she said, but you need to understand where we're coming from. She went on to say they loved both their children equally and didn't want this to drive a wedge in the family. I didn't respond. For once, I wasn't going to let them sweep everything under the rug with vague assurances and empty platitudes. At first, my parents seemed to think my silence was temporary. My mom sent texts asking how I was doing, and my dad occasionally forwarded jokes or articles he thought I'd like. I kept my replies short and infrequent, sticking to neutral topics when I responded at all. After a few weeks, my mom started calling more often, leaving voicemails that grew increasingly concerned. We haven't heard from you much, she said in one. Is everything okay? I ignored most of the messages, but when I finally answered a call a month later, she immediately asked, why have you been so distant? Her tone was accusatory, as if I was the one at fault. I'm taking some space, I said calmly. I need time to figure out what I want from this relationship because right now it doesn't feel healthy. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice rising. We're your parents. We've always done our best for you. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay composed. Your best hasn't felt good enough, I said. You've made it clear where I stand in this family. Until you can treat me with the same respect and care you show my sister, I'm not interested in pretending everything is fine. The line went quiet for a moment, and then she started justifying their actions again. We didn't mean to make you feel less important, she said. But your sister, she's more sensitive. She needs more from us, and we've always trusted you to be strong and independent. Do you hear yourself? I interrupted. You're saying the same thing over and over, and it's not an excuse. It doesn't matter if she's more sensitive. I deserve to feel valued too. And I don't. But we love you, she said, her voice cracking. Love isn't enough, I replied. You have to show it in your actions. And for years, your actions have told me I don't matter as much. I can't keep pretending that doesn't affect me. My dad jumped in at that point, his tone placating. "We've always tried to do what's best for the family," he said. "If we made mistakes, we're sorry. But cutting us off isn't the answer." "I'm not cutting you off," I clarified. "I'm taking space." "There's a difference." "But you don't have to," my mom insisted. "Can't we just move past this?" "I don't think you're really listening to me," I said. "This isn't something I can just move past without things changing. And right now, I don't feel like you're willing to change." Over the next few months, I kept my boundaries firm. I didn't initiate contact, and when they reached out, I stayed polite but distant. At first, they continued to frame my actions as dramatic or unnecessary, but as time went on, their tone shifted. My mom started sending longer messages, apologizing in a way that felt more genuine. "I'm sorry if we've made you feel less important," one text read. "We've never meant to hurt you, but I think we've taken your strength for granted." I appreciated the sentiment, but it still felt incomplete. An apology without action didn't mean much to me anymore. My sister, surprisingly, stayed out of it. She hadn't reached out since the confrontation, and while part of me was hurt by her silence, another part of me was relieved. I didn't have the energy to deal with her defensiveness on top of everything else. As the months went on, I started to notice a shift in myself. I wasn't constantly waiting for my parents' validation anymore. I wasn't replaying old memories or holding my breath, hoping they'd finally treat me equally. Instead, I focused on the relationships that made me feel valued: friends, coworkers, even extended family members like Aunt Diane. Slowly but surely, I began to feel lighter, freer. When my parents reached out now, it didn't sting the way it used to. Their messages still carried hints of guilt and justification, but I could read them without feeling the familiar pang of frustration. I hadn't fully decided what the future of our relationship would look like, but for now, I was content to let things be. Taking space had shown me something I hadn't realized before. I didn't need their approval to feel whole. By the time the holidays rolled around, I got a message from my dad asking if I wanted to come home for Christmas. "We'd love to see you," he wrote. "It would mean a lot to us." I sat with the message for a while, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to go, to see if things had really changed. But another part of me was cautious, unwilling to risk falling back into old patterns. Ultimately, I decided to reply honestly. "I'm not ready yet," I wrote. "I need more time, and I hope you can respect that." Their reply was shorter than I expected, but surprisingly understanding. "We'll be here when you're ready." For the first time in years, I felt like they were starting to listen. Whether that would lead to real change remained to be seen, but for now, I was okay with taking things one step at a time. This time, I was putting myself first, and that felt like the greatest gift of all. In the weeks and months after I drew my line in the sand, life started to feel quieter. At first, the silence was unsettling. I'd spent so many years entangled in my parents' expectations, their excuses, their constant favoritism, that stepping back felt like untangling myself from a web. But once I got used to it, the space was freeing. I threw myself into reconnecting with friends I hadn't prioritized while I was wrapped up in trying to gain my family's approval. I went out more, said yes to invitations I'd once ignored, and even reconnected with some old coworkers who had always been kind to me. Slowly, I started to rebuild a support system, not from obligation or shared history, but from people who genuinely valued me for who I was. I leaned heavily on my chosen family during this time. Friends who called just to check in, who listened without judgment when I vented about my parents, and who reminded me that my worth wasn't tied to how my family treated me. They celebrated my wins, big and small, in a way that my parents rarely had. It felt strange at first to receive so much validation, but over time, I started to accept it without second-guessing. My parents' absence still hurt, of course. There were moments when I'd catch myself wondering if they missed me, if they regretted the choices that led us to this point. Holidays were the hardest. Seeing pictures of my sister with my parents, smiling and cheerful, brought a familiar pang of loneliness. But those moments were tempered by a growing clarity. Their absence had taught me something I hadn't realized before: how much energy I'd been pouring into a relationship that gave so little in return. For years, I'd been chasing their approval, twisting myself into knots to fit their narrative, and sacrificing my own peace for the faint hope that they'd finally see me as equal to my sister. Stepping back had forced me to confront the truth. They might never change, and I couldn't keep waiting for them to. Instead of mourning what I didn't have, I started focusing on what I did. I threw myself into my hobbies, rediscovering passions I'd neglected. I signed up for art classes, joined a local hiking group, and even started volunteering at an animal shelter. For the first time in years, my life felt full in ways that had nothing to do with my family. About 6 months after the confrontation, my sister reached out. Her message caught me off guard. We hadn't spoken since the Paris trip, and I wasn't sure how to feel about hearing from her now. "Hey," her text began. "I've been thinking about everything, and I want to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize how unfair it all was. I think Mom and Dad, well, I don't know, but I hope we can talk." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe she was sincere, that she'd finally seen the imbalance for what it was. But another part of me couldn't help but wonder if this was guilt talking, a way to clear her conscience without fully owning her role in the dynamic. Eventually, I replied with something simple. "Thanks for reaching out. I need some time to think." Whether or not her apology was genuine, I wasn't ready to dive back into that relationship. I needed to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to build, and I wasn't willing to jeopardize that for the sake of a rushed reconciliation. As time went on, I found myself thinking less and less about my parents and sister. Not because I didn't care, but because I was finally carving out a life that didn't revolve around their approval. I focused on the people who showed up for me, the ones who celebrated me without needing to be asked. Aunt Diane remained a steady presence, her support unwavering. She reminded me that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who lift you up, who see you, and who make you feel like you matter. I started to embrace that idea fully. Family didn't have to mean parents and siblings who couldn't see my worth. It could mean friends who showed up at my door with takeout when I was having a bad day, co-workers who cheered for my accomplishments, and mentors who believed in my potential. In the end, I realized that stepping back from my parents wasn't about punishing them or cutting ties forever. It was about setting boundaries and protecting myself from the hurt their actions had caused. Maybe one day they'd truly understand the impact of their favoritism, but I wasn't waiting around for that day to come. I wasn't bitter anymore, just resolved. I deserved to feel valued, to have relationships that made me feel seen and heard. If my parents couldn't give me that, I'd surround myself with people who could. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly moving forward, unburdened by the weight of their approval. And that was worth more than any trip, any gift, or any apology they could have offered.